Hi, I'm Suzanne Turner, and welcome to a podcast delving into the personal narratives within the clinical research industry. Through candid interviews, we'll learn about the personal journeys and motivations of individuals who have chosen this profession, what I like to call their why. This podcast is not just for industry insiders. It's for everyone curious about the human side of healthcare. Beyond the industry's negative reputation, we'll shed light on the dedicated professionals behind clinical trials. Join us as we uncover the heart and passion of those working tirelessly behind the scenes in clinical research. Welcome to Heart of the Trial. Hello, lovely listeners. Welcome to Heart of the Trial, where we uncover the human stories within clinical research and shed a positive light on the pharmaceutical industry. I'm your host, Suzanne Turner, and today we will be talking about the most essential part of clinical trials, which is the patients, with Pauline Frank. So welcome to the podcast, Pauline.
Thank you, Suzanne, for inviting me.
Yes. So this is very exciting because, again, we don't have clinical trials without patients, and that's your focus. So why don't you tell our listeners what it is that you do?
So first of all, as you mentioned, the clinical trials are about the patients, and my role is not as a patient advocate, and I want to be very clear with that because I work with patient advocates, and they do a very, very important job to ensure that they bring the lived experience of patients, the expertise of how the patients uh, manage their disease and what's important to them,
Mhm.
and that's their role. And I've worked closely with a number of patient advocates, with clinical trial teams as well, to bridge the two. So how do we bridge the clinical trial teams and what they do to run the trials operationally, get all of those things that we need a trial to do, but then also not forget that the end result is that we are doing this for the patients, and it's
Mhm.
not just about endpoints. It's not just about surrogate markers. There's actually people there that we need to help with what we're trying to do. So my role is to bridge this and
Uh-huh.
and strengthen the voice of the patient and the advocates within the clinical trial setting.
So would you say, like, I believe your title on LinkedIn is you have something like patient and increasing patient engagement. Is that how you like to go about talking about it?
Yeah, I really believe that it is about patient engagement, and improving it, but also what I have is about how do we innovate. So we have talked about patient engagement honestly for about
Mhm.
10 years, or the advocates have been talking a lot about patient engagement. And in the industry, I would say more so in the last 5 years. But how do we move beyond that and not just talk about it? How do we actually really get it happening? And with
Mhm.
trial teams, make it really, really happen. And that's where my focus, my passion is
Yeah.
taking it from talking about it and actually working with trial teams to say, okay, where are your challenges? Where are your barriers, and how can we enable you to be able to execute the study and do what you need to do, but then also bring that patient piece in as part of the process and how you deliver the study. So that's really my mission, is not, yeah, walking the talk basically, and not just
Yeah.
talking. Yeah.
And why is it important to have the patient engagement and the patient involvement during these trials?
Well, first of all, if you look at the statistics out there, frankly, we know that the way studies are being done for a very long time is not really effective. Um,
Mhm.
Very commonly, quite a statistic is that 80% of studies are not recruiting properly. They have delays. And why is that? Is because the studies are not designed in a way that patients see the value. It's too burdensome. It's designed for science, for investigators, not necessarily asking patients, but what is it that you want to get out of this? And how can we help you participate better? So this is why it's important, because first of all, we're not doing really well. And every time I go to a conference around clinical trials, I hear the same statistic and it doesn't actually
Yeah.
improve. So the question is,
Interesting.
well, why don't we do something different? Why are we still doing the same things and being resistant to including the patient more. We have evidence actually when patients or families of patients are involved in the study, it does
Yeah.
actually improve the recruitment. It does improve how patients are receptive and trust the
Mhm.
study. So it is almost interesting to see, though there is still resistance. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
so this is
Yeah, I'm kind of new to this side of it, as crazy as it sounds, 'cause I've been in the industry for about 12 years now, I think. I just came up on my 12th anniversary, and so pretty much just kind of for any listeners that may be new to the process, what the standard process really is the clinical teams and the sponsors and the CROs work together to develop this trial. And then they go and they find what we call investigators, which would be the doctors, the sites that um, we need to participate. And then those doctors go out and they find the patients, right? So that's what you mean when you say recruit, is finding the patients to actually participate in the trials. And what you're saying is that they're missing the step where they're taking the actual feedback from the end user, the patient, and getting that input. And that's where this has led to this 80% number where I was reading your fantastic article that you have about like the reality on why it's not see what's it called, the reality of patient engagement not living up to its theory. And you were saying that this it leads to cost issues and time delays because there's that gap. That's correct?
well, actually, I would say it's the perception and the concern of the trial teams. So, what I
Yeah.
wrote about was my experience having worked
Mhm.
with study teams and advocates, but also working in the industry and talking to a lot of folks who actually run the clinical trials. It's actually the perception about
Yeah.
patient engagement taking more time. It's going to make us
Mm.
slower. We're not going to get this study started if we talk to patients, and it's going to cost us more because we're going to have to uh, include more
Right.
stakeholders.
Pay for more individuals to
I mean,
participate.
we compensate actually patient
Yeah.
advocates and patient experts, and they
Yeah.
worry, well, how much is this going to cost us? So it's
Mhm.
actually not saying that it actually does delay or cost. It's just the perception, and that is actually the barrier that trial teams have, is that they perceive this, but in reality, it doesn't actually really delay the study
Yeah.
in that a significant way that they think it would, and it doesn't actually
Mhm.
cost so much money that they think it would. And so when you actually do it, they realize, okay, it's actually not what they had thought it would be, but they
Right.
have to take the step of actually taking that brave step of really, let's do it and let's include the
Yeah.
patient voice. And ultimately, what happens is we save time in the end because if we do
Mhm.
recruit well, if patients don't drop out at the high rate that in some studies they drop out, then we have to find more patients. We
Right.
actually have seen that we actually recruit faster in the end.
Yeah.
And so trying to get people to understand this is it's getting them to see the bigger picture and the longer term
Right.
vision. Um, and that is the challenge.
Yeah, and I really it was kind of neat because as I was reading your article, I really felt a connection to it because, my expertise is in the trial master file and I really feel like we've had the same issues like you were talking about trying to put a value to it and showing that value and how that a lot of sponsors will wait until it's like on fire before they bring in those like patient advocacy experts or whatever. And I have that exact same experience. I feel like the industry is slowly changing, but it's the same way. Like I really felt a connection there because I'm like, yes, some of these roles that we have in these trials, it's hard to put a value to them. And I think it's really cool that while the perception may be that it's going to cost time or money or whatever, that in the end, if they're starting it from the beginning, if they're bringing in individuals like you and patient advocacies and working on that, that they actually could have more efficient and um, reduce costs in their trials.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And someone like in my role, I mean, I worked in a large pharmaceutical company in this
Mm-hmm.
role of a patient engagement.
Yeah.
almost like a liaison between the study team and the patient advocates.
Yeah.
And um, I can definitely say that when you speak to different stakeholders, they do have different thinking and mindset.
Mhm.
And then it's like, how do you bring these people together so that we're talking the
Mhm.
same language? However, as you say, the value of
Mhm.
making this effort, it's not easy to quantify.
Yeah.
It is. We know it's the right thing to do, and I think the challenge is that we are still trying to find what is it from this
Mhm.
engagement that we can say, like like a number, or people want a number, people want
Mhm. I know.
some
Yeah.
kind of a
Mhm.
value that they can really touch. And I think that's the challenge, because it's something that brings the holistic value to the study. And I have seen really great advice given from patient experts into a study
Yeah.
where things that were a blind spot for them, the study team couldn't really see, and then they could uncover this blind spot. But then how do you then share it with the whole world? I think that's a challenge as
Right.
well, because sometimes these trials are very confidential in how they've been designed and
Right.
how things have been changed. And it would be great if we can share more of, well, what did we change? What happened?
Mhm.
Because I think there's a lot of really great examples, but because of sometimes the confidentiality of the nature of the study, we're not able to share also the examples. And I think that's also another challenge, because then
Mhm.
unless people see actual examples, they think, okay, that's nice, but they still don't quite
Mhm.
understand, what do we get out of it.
Right.
And I think that's the whole chicken and egg challenge
Yeah.
there, right?
Yes.
And I think once you actually gone through a real good experience, then you get it. But also, I've seen sometimes it has gone wrong. Sometimes somehow the
Yeah.
engagement doesn't somehow work for different
Yeah.
reasons. Maybe misunderstanding between advocates and the clinical study team, different
Mhm.
expectations not met. Sometimes it doesn't go so well. And I guess that's why, at least in my role, trying to be that liaison, I
Right.
try to find that interface where it works.
Right.
Because yeah, there's, I think, a lot of different experiences that people have had, and that's why you
Yeah.
have a lot of heterogeneity in how people see the engagement.
Yeah. Do you feel like, since you've been doing this, there's kind of a, how do I want to say this, kind of a specific pattern that you tend to follow when you're doing this liaising? Or do you feel like every situation is so unique that you just have to go off experience and listening to both sides and kind of go from that way? Do you understand what I'm asking?
I do. I think what is very important, first of all, especially for the study teams, is to have it as part of their process that they work in,
Mhm.
because they are very, operational in terms of, okay, they have their
Yeah.
timelines, they know the steps. And if it's too soft and grey, I think it's very hard for them to know how to integrate it into the overall operations of the study. So
Mhm.
the one thing I think that must really actually be very standardized is the process, the timeline, who does what, who's responsible for what, um, how long before first patient first visit do we actually need to start this?
Uh-huh.
And then besides that, it is actually can be different depending on the disease area. Some disease areas, you have patient organizations or patient advocates that are a lot more experienced. They've been
Mhm.
doing this for a lot longer. So you find the expertise is a different level. And then there's other disease areas where it's less mature,
Mhm.
the advocacy, and you find it's a little bit different. So you do need to pick the advocates as best as you can, that
Mhm.
can put into the study some good, meaningful input, because they hopefully have had a lot more experience. But sometimes it's hard because it's in some diseases there's less experience,
Mm,
and then you have
mhm.
to adjust the different styles of the advocates, the different maybe expertise, maybe we need to educate a little bit, provide them a little bit more information,
Mhm.
rather than just giving them a 100-page protocol and ask them to tell us what they think. That maybe some more guiding navigation is needed. So there's
Mhm.
two elements: process, but then also we're dealing with people who don't
Mhm.
work in clinical trials.
Right.
Some understand them very well, but there's a lot of complex bits around a study,
Yes.
and I really think we need to be aware of that. It's a learning exercise, I think, for both parties.
Yeah. And I actually had my first experience with this in the last just within the last couple of years. I was working with a sponsor. It was a small biotech, and um, they actually had a patient advocate individual that was in there. Like I said, the first time I've ever seen that. And in that case, he would then connect with like a group of I would assume patients that were, so this happened to be geared towards children, so it was like parents of
Mhm,
children who were impacted by it, or individuals who'd been impacted it during their life and all. And he was kind of that bridge to the clinical trial team, where they would have like reoccurring meetings and all. Is that usually how the patient advocacy process works? Is there's like an individual who's like part of the team, and then they work with this group, or is that not always how it works?
so more and more you do see a patient advocate, if you mean like that's employed by, are
Mhm.
you talking about someone
Yeah,
that's
he was
employed by the
employed by the
company? But
sponsor.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's where sometimes the terminology gets a bit confusing, because we do have
Yeah.
people working in biotech pharma called patient advocates, and their
Yeah.
title is patient advocate, say, manager or patient advocate director. So it is a bit confusing. Then you talk
Mhm.
about the actual patient advocates who actually work in the patient organizations, which typically are not for profit. So the one that you probably refer to, Suzanne, was someone, I would say, probably in the role that I have played in my company. Um,
Mhm.
I had a different title, patient engagement director, so it
Yeah.
was just different, but that the goal was the same. So it is like this, like a relationship manager, a liaison, who then help teams internally. So it could be clinical trial teams, but it also could be medical, commercial, and
Yeah.
whoever wanted to then liaise with patient groups, they were the relationship holder to the patient
Yeah.
group, and they would help facilitate at least the initial connection and to clarify what's the objective of the engagement and just make sure that it's done properly. And then afterwards, yeah, once you've then had that initial connection, you may then just work directly with the patient organisation or advocate without that person in the middle or the liaison. So a lot of
Mhm.
companies are having people in this role, a lot of, but then there's companies that may not have them because they
Mhm.
may not have the headcount. So this is where you also have potentially external companies that offer that service, and they do a similar because you kind of a service. So it can be that a fully internal person, or you can have
Mhm.
someone that works in an external company that provides that service as well. So
And at
it
what
is becoming more, yeah, more of a thing now actually to have that role.
And at what point do they usually bring like someone like you in to help? Like you said, you like bridge that gap between like the advocates and the clinical teams.
Yeah, so if you have someone already internally in the role, then that's their job. And
Hmm.
then, so when I was internally in a pharmaceutical company, I did that
Yeah.
role. And now I actually have transitioned into my own venture,
Right.
where that is actually what I do, but coming from an
Yeah.
external company.
So if the
And
sponsor
really,
can't afford a full time employee, they can work with someone like you who
yes.
does the same thing, and they contract you to assist.
Exactly. Or to be a second pair of hands. Maybe they actually have
Yeah.
someone in place, but sometimes there's so many trials or so many activities
Yeah.
happening. And I know what it's like working across many
Yeah.
disease areas. You just don't have the capacity to do everything yourself. And so I
Yeah.
had a second pair of hands helping me at that time. So it can be either someone fulfilling that role that I don't have internal, or that additional support. And then you can be sure that you really do a proper job. And the reason why I say that is people underestimate how much planning that you have
Yeah.
to do for these kind of engagements.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of what we've seen historically is what we call tick the box exercises. So people say,
Oh.
oh, well, we talked to a patient, I tick the box off now.
Oh,
We've done it.
no.
But then when you actually think, okay, well, what happened from that engagement? Did we really use their insights or did we just listen and then did what we wanted to do anyway?
Right.
So I think historically, because that has happened a lot, or patients just didn't feel it, they didn't get any feedback. So they would
Yeah.
give their time, but then they heard nothing back from the company. And then
Yeah.
it gives the impression that, well, did I really waste my time or did,
Yeah.
did they really use the input? And it is exhausting because you can imagine, especially in diseases areas where there's fewer patient advocates, and imagine
Right.
all the companies coming to ask, there is, the burnout of the patient advocates potentially, but then if they're not being used for their time effectively, that's really a
Yeah.
concern. And that's why having someone to really make sure, have we planned it effectively? Have we asked the right
Mhm.
questions? Have we given both advocates enough information as well as maybe the study team enough information?
Yeah.
That takes a bit of planning, and people underestimate that. And when they just think, oh, well, we just jump on a call and then it just happens like this, and we'll just send them the protocol and the ICF, and then,
Yeah.
it just happens like that. I think that's where sometimes there's disappointment in the results.
Yeah.
And it
And I
comes down to
mean,
not planning properly.
I would think it would take quite a bit of skills too, because you have to be able to understand what's happening in the trial and be able to explain that in layman terms when the advocates are struggling, right? Because I've read the protocols, I've read those documents, and it's a lot of jargon. And so I can imagine, just the everyday person, and like you said, that they can't just give them these documents and be like, okay, give us feedback. So you have to be able to interpret that into a way that they understand.
Yeah, and it definitely depends on the advocate too. So some of them, maybe you can give them
Yeah.
the whole document and they could really work it out, but others cannot. So I think you don't want to assume. And
Yeah.
as you mentioned, yes, we do need to get their understanding of their level of how much they understand. Even
Right.
investigators complain that the protocols are complex. So if the investigators complain the protocols are complex, imagine giving it to
Yeah, and
someone
they've
who's
done
not a
years of medical
specialist.
school, so yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And so you have to check people's understanding, but also navigate, do some pre-thinking and saying, well,
Yeah.
we know these are potential problems, so maybe be very specific with the questions you want to ask them,
Yeah.
and then give them the full document, and maybe they pick up things that we didn't think of asking. But I think some level of navigation is very important, um, and some things that are complex, we should try to take more time to explain. And I give
Mhm.
an example. I mean, the whole topic of PROs, patient-reported outcomes, sometimes I think there's dissatisfaction from patient advocates that what PROs are
Mhm.
selected are not actually measuring what's important to patients. They're just something
Oh.
that was created by doctors 50 years ago, and we're still using the same PROs. So
Oh.
in some disease areas, many disease areas, they're saying they're not really measuring what patients actually think are relevant. And so yes, there's also, that understanding, well, how do you introduce new PROs and how is it done? You can't just like, take something and then just put it into a
Mhm.
study. It takes a lot of validation. So I think
Right.
some concepts within a study, it does require a bit more explanation if you're not an expert. And this is where sometimes I've seen misunderstanding between what patient advocates expect versus what the clinical trial teams say, this is what we can do. So it's important to get that education actually where you think it's needed.
Yeah. And so how was it that you got into this? Because you've mentioned that you were in a type of patient advocate role before. So like how did you start this journey?
Yes, so I've worked for many years in the pharmaceutical industry, many different roles, and it's, I ended up in my last role in this patient engagement and insights area, especially in oncology hematology. So I have to say I was very fortunate just with skills I was able to take on this role. And I have to say I had to do a lot of different things. I had to work with many different teams. I was sitting in medical affairs, but then having to, work on launch, having
Mm,
to work on many different elements. So working with clinical trial teams in patient engagement was one component.
yeah,
And after spending about 6 years of doing a lot of this work, running ad boards and doing patient research in many, many different areas, I realized at a certain point that the most interesting aspect for me for patient engagement, which was the game changer, was really that patient voice in the clinical studies.
yeah,
And if we don't get it early enough in the development life cycle of a product,
yeah.
and often we come too late, then it
Mhm.
is very difficult to change things that and make it really, you know, really the right product or the right drug for the patients or the right delivery. And so this bit I really felt passionate about because I knew also it was a struggle, that it was actually one of the hardest things to do was to
Yeah,
do patient engagement properly in clinical trials and early with study teams. I really like study teams, I have to say. I really
yeah,
appreciate the clinical teams because I find them very honest.
yeah,
Um, they'll give you the honest feedback, and I really
yeah,
appreciate that. So when something's not working, they will tell you. Um, they won't sell you something
yeah,
that's not reality, and that's why I appreciate working with them in patient engagement because you know when something's working and when you know it's not working because they will just tell you.
yeah,
and
yeah,
and so I have to say I really did enjoy very much working with the trial teams, and so when I wanted to do something new this year and yeah, really focus on something I felt passionate about. This is
mhm,
why I chose this area because I just found it such value to work with clinical trial teams, and at the same time, it was such a big unmet need to get patient
yeah,
engagement really, really happening. So again, I mean, a lot of fantastic advocates and organizations out there trying to push for this,
yeah,
um, and really, but when it comes to biopharma, you know, we need a little bit of help. And so
yeah,
that's why I'm trying to get this engine running. A lot of great work
yeah,
happened already, but I think unless everybody is doing it, it's no point if the it's no point if the biggest pharmaceutical companies are doing good patient engagement. That's what I've realized.
yeah,
Um, there's so many great innovation coming from small
yes,
medium biotech pharma. And I would actually
yeah,
even say a lot of the innovation is really driven from biotech.
yeah,
And then big pharma acquires their
yeah,
pipeline,
mhm,
right?
yeah,
And then if we're not helping the small to medium companies do really good patient engagement, then it ends up having this flow-on effect that hits big pharma as well. And then by the time big pharma gets the compounds, it's actually quite late. So
yeah,
another component is I've worked in big pharma, but I've
yeah,
realized the innovation is really happening somewhere
yeah,
else, actually a lot. And this
yeah,
is actually my focus is really more on these guys that don't have
yes,
the resources to do it
yes,
by themselves.
yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
we really have that in common. I'm very passionate as well about like the smaller pharma when it comes to TMF because like I feel like they need me more, that
Mm.
they need that expertise. So I think that's super cool. And you've been doing this, like you've been in the industry for a while now, right? Like,
Yeah, I've been in the industry for about 17 years and
yeah,
very different roles. And as the last 6 years in patient engagement, specifically. Yeah, so it's been a lot and I've seen a lot. um,
yeah.
yeah, but I find this area really, really exciting. And if we can get it right, I think it will be really a game changer for the industry.
Yeah, and do you feel like that's your kind of your why and what keeps you going, or was there something else that really kind of got you into this?
Yeah, it definitely is. It's the why for me is that we don't keep on operating as we have for the last 30 years in the
Yeah,
industry.
mhm.
Um,
Need
because
growth. Yeah.
I think we need to really take a lot of reflection and
Mhm.
saying, okay, is it the model that we've been operating on? Is it actually going to be sustainable moving forward? Um,
Mhm.
is it really meeting the needs of patients? And we are hearing very loud and clear from patient organizations and advocates that no, it's not.
Yeah.
And the thing is, they've also grown a lot in terms of strength,
Yeah.
and their visibility in the industry. Patient
Oh, that's
organizations, patient
cool.
advocates, it's grown a lot, and so we can't almost ignore it anymore. And I think
Yeah.
this is also the why, is that we really need to listen, we really need to do something different. And it feels
Yeah.
uncomfortable because I think in the industry, we're typically used to dealing with physicians and
Right.
investigators. It's a different type of a stakeholder, of course, regulators, HTA bodies. And I have to say, when I first started many years ago, I had very honest feedback from some of my senior leaders saying, Pauline, people actually feel a bit uncomfortable talking to patients. Even though we're doing all of this for
Yeah.
patients, they admitted that it's uncomfortable because they're just not
Interesting.
used to doing it. And
Yeah.
I think now there's more comfort, I have to
Yeah.
say, but this is actually where it stems from. Some people are almost like afraid that, oh, what if they tell me something and I don't know what to do about it? I think that's also that fear, I've noticed as well. So it's very interesting.
Interesting.
And I think
Yeah.
people mean well. Everyone is
Yeah.
trying to do the right thing, but it's just a different way of working. It's a different stakeholder. Patients communicate differently than,
Yeah.
say, physicians. So it's
Right.
just a different type of listening or type of active listening we have to do. And maybe the priorities that they tell us is different to what we've always assumed. So I think
Yeah.
we work with a lot of assumptions in the industry. We assume a
Yeah.
lot. And I've always found it fascinating that I've run advisory boards where we would say, okay, this is what we're thinking of for a digital health solution. What do you think? And then being told, no, we don't like it.
Uh-oh.
And had we not asked, what they probably would have gone ahead and rolled it out. But because we asked, we
Yeah.
end up coming up with another solution that they said,
Yeah.
no, this is actually what we need instead.
Yeah.
So it's also a lot of, I think, investment and resources we've done in the past that we turned out realizing this is not what patients actually want.
Yeah.
And so if we
It is
really want
kinda
to be smarter,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, like, I make this reference with, like, writing SOPs and stuff, where you have to take the end user into account, and to think that the industry's gone on so long without doing that that really is very crazy. The ones who you're doing it for and you're not listening to them. So I think that's really cool that you're putting your passion into this, um and that you've seen for yourself when those positive outcomes for it. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, I think there's a nice saying that I've heard from the advocates where they say,
Yeah.
um, don't, make like do it. Hold on, let me think about it. What's it called again?
Yeah.
Yeah, don't do it for us, but do it with us, or something along the lines of
Oh,
that. I mean, I
yeah.
haven't said it so
Yes.
eloquently, but it's really about how industry has traditionally just churned out medicines for patients who are the end recipients. But
Yeah.
patients now actually want to be the ones who define the research priorities. They want to actually
Yeah.
say what actually research actually needs to be done in their disease area, um, and not just get something down the line. So I think it's very
Yeah.
interesting, that what's happening.
That is really neat. And another thing that really stood out to me in your article, was how you were saying, like, it has to be more than just like one or a few people who are passionate about this within an organization. It really needs to be top down. Everyone's all in. Like, we are doing this patient engagement. We're going to listen to these advocates, because without that, like, the chances of success are so slim.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think any kind of change you introduce into an organization, and I always say it's not only the case in patient engagement. When you want an organization to do something differently,
Yeah.
you need that top down, but then you
Yeah.
need also the people who have to do the job to also
Yes.
embrace what needs to be done differently. And
Yes.
I mean, I've seen in many different companies, many efforts around getting patient engagement moving. Um, Everyone seems to then reorganize and things change. So the model changes
Yeah.
a lot. So when you think it goes this way, then things change all over again. So I think that has been the challenge for many people who really believe in this in the
Mhm.
industry,
Yeah.
because sometimes just what's happening, they don't have any control over.
Yeah.
And then you feel, oh gosh, now we have to almost like start because we have now new leadership. We have to redefine what
Yeah.
this looks like in a new business model. And I think that's been the challenge where a lot of people are very passionate about it, but it's just been made a bit harder for them because of the environment. But I have to
Yeah.
say, there are good, really people do believe in
Yeah.
it, and I think they always move forward with it somehow. But you do really need everyone to really embrace it as part of what they do, and it's part of what I say is in their DNA.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if they say, "Well, it's somebody else's job, it's not my job,"
Ooh.
um,
Yeah.
it's actually everybody's job. That's what
Yeah.
I think. Every component really helps bring it forward, and
Yeah.
this is, I think, the key to success. And I would say, especially clinical trial teams,
Yes.
if they also embrace it, and they're actually really important stakeholders if we want to make patient
Yes.
engagement work in research. But then they do need help as well.
Yeah.
So it's also knowing that how do we help them and not just
Mm.
drop it on them and saying you just have to do it, because
Yeah.
then I think it doesn't work. So it's about helping them through the change as well.
Do you think that part of it also is a lack of knowledge in the industry? Because, like I said, like, I've been in the industry for a long time, and this is really guaranteed I'm in a different kind of side of it. I'm the one
Mhm.
that all the documents come to afterwards, versus being, um, deep in the trial itself. But do you think that, like, there's a gap here where a lot of people may not even realize that this should be an important part of the
Yeah, I
trials?
actually think now it's getting to a stage where we've heard so much about it. I
Yeah.
actually think, and in my article, perfect example, pop it into
Yeah.
ChatGPT. It'll tell you
Yeah.
exactly why patient engagement is important in clinical trials.
Yeah.
It knows that. And, ChatGPT is built on historical data, right? So
Yes.
data's out there. So we know that it's a good thing to do.
Yeah.
I think the challenge is with what we call the gap between what we know and then what we actually end up doing. So the knowledge and then the implementation of the knowledge.
Right.
And I think that is the gap. And that's a little bit also where I really want to focus, because
Yeah.
people know this already. They've heard it 100 times actually in some
Yeah.
cases. But then when they actually have to do it and apply it in their daily job, that's where they get stuck. And
Yeah.
that's where if you can help redefine the processes so that it becomes integrated into what they do,
Right.
they don't need to think about it as an extra task. They just know, "Oh, now it's at the
It
step and
just
I just have to do
yeah.
it. And now I know I go to this person to get help, and I know it takes
Yeah.
them this amount of time, and know that approximately it's gonna be costing me this much." So once you really standardize it and operationalize it, it's not a surprise anymore. I think that's the important thing to do. And then of course, the soft skills, as we mentioned, right, to help support
Right.
the team. But at a minimum, that I think is what has been holding people back. They don't know how to
Yeah.
start it, and they don't know how to sometimes troubleshoot. And that's, yeah,
Yeah.
that's a couple of things, because things do go wrong. It's not
Yeah.
perfect,
With
right?
everything.
And
Yeah.
if you don't know how to manage, potentially conflict that arises or some issue that's unexpected,
Yeah.
then it becomes, it feels like a not a good experience, and then people are less enthusiastic about it. But I can
Yeah.
tell you that you'll always find a solution as long as there's good communication between the different parties.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing what just communication can do.
Yeah. We take the
Yes.
time. Yes.
Yes. So, if there was like one thing you could leave to the audience, like one thing you'd want to say when it comes to, patient engagement and trials and all, what would you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah. So I think the most pressing thing I think we need to do at this stage is to walk the talk. And
Yeah.
it's it's small steps. You don't need to do something huge. The best way is to just get started, get the right
Mhm.
support and advice. Don't go blind in it. Um,
Yeah.
you know, try to understand what's the best way to do it, but just get started. And we learn. We learn from doing. So
Mhm.
I can tell you, for me, definitely when I started working this area, there was very little for me to really, put my finger on.
Mhm.
And you just have to be brave, and then as you progress, you learn, and then you understand how things work. So I think that's the most important thing, is to get that experience, um, and then it becomes less of something to fear, actually.
Mhm.
So yeah, we have to start walking the talk.
Oh, I love that advice, Pauline. That sums it up perfectly. This has been such a fantastic discussion today. So I really appreciate your time. But before I let you go, can we tell the audience how they can reach out to you if they want to be in contact?
Yes, so I'm available either on LinkedIn, Pauline Frank, or you can contact me at pauline@patientconnects.com. So that
Awesome.
is my direct email address, and Patient Connects is my, I would say it's my passion project,
Yeah.
where if I can help trial teams have better engagements with patient advocates and make the process a lot more smoother, then happy to help.
Oh, that is fantastic. Thank you again so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Suzanne. It was a pleasure.
Thanks. Thanks. Bye-bye. This brings us to the end of today's episode. I want to extend my sincere thanks to our guest for sharing their inspiring journey. If you'd like to connect with them, you can find their contact information in the show notes. I also want to express my gratitude to you for joining us on this exploration of the clinical research industry. I hope you found today's episode insightful. If so, please consider leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. It truly helps us reach more listeners. If you have any feedback, questions, or comments about the show, feel free to email me at podcast@iceconsultingllc.com. Thank you once again, and I look forward to having you joining us on our next episode of Heart of the Trial.